People owe 4th edition an apology. Yes, I decided the first system I wanted to cover this year might be the most polarizing. As I've learned from Blue Sky, both its lovers and its haters are very passionate about the game, and I'm probably going to upset both groups with this video. Oh goody, Dagger Heart, made by Darrington Press, aka the Critical Role publishing company who puts out all kinds of TTRPG stuff. I want to make it clear that now, whilst I am a fan of Critical Role, I'm not going to treat the system any differently than I normally do. Preamble out the way, let's start with the basics. Dagger Heart by default is a high fantasy TTRPG with a heavy focus on roleplay, adventuring, and creating your group's stories. It's designed to be applied to many settings and does have some really interesting mechanics designed around making settings, known as campaign frames, but we'll be covering that later. I first want to talk about what goes into a character, and of course we start with our class. Dagger Heart has a solid 9 classes, each with 2 subclasses to choose from. These include Bard, Druid, Guardian, Ranger, Rogue, Seraph, Sorcerer, Warrior, and Wizard. I'm going on a slight tangent real quick because the way they've handled Druid is one of the best examples of transforming into animal mechanics I've seen. Having the animals be grouped nicely into categories that each have their own uses, strengths, and weaknesses, alongside the eventual ability to be able to create chimera forms, mashing a bunch of them together, absolutely fantastic. Back to classes, each is constructed of domains, starting evasion, hit points, class items, a hope feature, shared class features, and then our subclass features. And if you're a spellcasting class, your spellcast trait. I'll be expanding on what all this means later, but whilst it's not super clearly labelled in the class features themselves, foundation features are the ones you start with when you obtain the class, specialisation features are the ones that can be obtained at level 5, and mastery features are obtained at level 8. We next move on to our heritage, and they gave us plenty to work with off the bat. Heritage is split into 2 parts, ancestry and community. Ancestry is your species or lineage, your more physical appearance and traits, and there is a whopping 18 options to choose from basic humans to funky frog dudes. Community is our character's upbringing, where they were born and raised. I really like this combo, as whilst physical traits in fantasy games are going to be different between species, they will share their social and learned traits from the environments they've been moulded by, and I just think that's a really good way of expanding on a character's backstory and moving away from bioessentialism while still making the species choice matter. We then move to our trait, our primary stats that our characters use. Each character uses a standard array that they assign to their traits, this being +2, +1, +1, 0, 0, -1. The traits themselves are agility, strength, finesse, instinct, presence, and knowledge. Each of these are used in various checks that best relate to them. And speaking of checks, let's talk about skills, or rather the lack thereof. Yes, Dagger Heart doesn't have set skills, but rather make use of an experience system, not to be confused with experience point. An experience is exactly what it means, an event in the past that offers training, proficiency, or knowledge in an area. They are basically custom skills. You choose a word or phrase that best fits the character's ability, and if it can be applied to the situation you're rolling for, you do so. These are typically designed around the background you build around your character. If you decide you want to be some kind of assassin, you'd likely create experiences designed around sneaking around. You could create your own stealth experience, or acrobatics, and so on. The background building process actually has a series of questions that helps the players construct a variety of words and phrases to reflect your character's training. Now, let's talk about the way all your abilities are sorted. Yes, this is the part where the 4E joke from earlier comes in, as all our abilities are in the forms of cards. Each class gives access to domains, which are groups of abilities that you can choose from at various stages. In total, this book provides 9 domains, each full of abilities centered around its theme. The Arcana domain, for example, is focused around pure magic, providing what would typically be spells elsewhere, both for offense and utility, whilst the Blow domain are physical abilities, mastery of weapons and special attacks. You choose some when you make your character and can obtain more as you level. There is a limit to how many cards you can have active at a time, with active cards being in your loadout and inactive ones being stored in your vault. Before I can really talk about more, I need to talk about the duality dice. This is the core role of the game. Whenever you make a skill check or attempt to do just about anything, you'll be rolling these. These are a set of 2 d12s, one being known as the Hope die, whilst the other being a Fear die. Players all have a resource called Hope, and this is generated whenever you make a roll of the Hope die being the higher number of the 2. In contrast, the game has a resource called Fear, which is generated whenever a player rolls with the Fear die having the greater number. These can be used as fuel for various abilities players and foes alike may have. For calculating the actual success of the roll, you add both die together and apply any modifiers, traits, experience, etc., and the resulting number is your result. We next talk about combat, and this is the section that will make or break the game for some people. At the risk of excelling some folk, this game has what I call vibe-based structure. There is technically some kind of structure, but it flows entirely at the whims of the group. There isn't an initiative or turn order, nor is there an action economy. The players and GM decide who does what in what order and how many actions they get based on what makes most sense to the story. It's a turn of whoever is in the spotlight, be it the GM or the player, and that can change at a moment's notice if the story demands. And while this does absolutely lend itself to storytelling, it means the game doesn't actually have balance. The stakes are much harder to implement, and it can often feel like freeform roleplay that makes the game around it feel somewhat redundant in my opinion. Now, there is the optional spotlight tracker rule. This rule suggests the use of tokens to represent a number of actions or moves each player gets per round of combat, to help avoid a single player hogging the spotlight for too long, and be able to pass actions around the table. This isn't quite an initiative, but can help prevent other players getting overly excited and ruining it for others. They suggest altering the number of tokens per round as needed, but I will admit it does feel like shifting the burden of balancing the game to its players and GM, rather than giving proper help in that. I mentioned moves earlier, but to better define them, it's a collective term for things you can do during your turn, such as using abilities, making attacks, or using your traits and experiences to perform unique actions or interactions. Hope can also be spent on tag team roles where you combine the roles, choosing from either player's hope and fear dice to put together for the action's result. Back in classes, I mentioned HP and evasion, so let's talk about the mechanics around those. Evasion is your ability to avoid or mitigate damage, with an emphasis on flavouring it around how your character would personally avoid damage, be it dodging or blocking, etc. It starts as a score set by your class, and can be affected by levelling up, items, skills, and so on. This is a number of things have to roll to be able to successfully hit you. When the hit does succeed, the weapon or ability will determine the damage, but this isn't a one-to-one with how much damage you end up taking. When you take damage, you compare the damage to your damage threshold. This is based off your current armour and affected by various skills, but it's a series of two numbers, the first being your major threshold, the second being your severe threshold. If the damage you receive is below the major threshold, you lose 1 HP. If the damage is between the major and severe threshold, you lose 2 HP. And if you take a damage above the severe threshold, you lose 3 HP. I think this both adds a nice layer of complexity to the game and also helps with trying to create a sense of balance. You can never be one-shot with this system, giving all players a fighting chance and mitigating chances of TPK. It also makes fights feel more back and forth of exchanging blows. It just feels more satisfying to me, although I will admit seeing large numbers become small can make things feel less impressive. We also have the stress mechanic, another status to keep track of. It represents a physical strain your characters are dealing with. Some enemies will inflict you with stress, and some of your own abilities are taxing enough to cause you stress as well. This is another subtle complexity that Dagger Heart has. Stress can massively impact combat. When it's maxed, you become vulnerable, but also any further stress comes directly out of your hit points, meaning you then have to balance using the more powerful stress-inducing abilities, and remembering if you max out your stress, you'll no longer be able to use those abilities and take more damage in kind. Speaking of damage, and this is where I feel a bit let down by the game, there are only two damage types, physical and magical. The game has the usual resistances and immunities, but with just these types it makes certain abilities feel very samey. It makes things simpler, sure, but it feels like a layer of complexity is just missing. The game does have its own advantage and disadvantage system, taking the form of a d6 that you add or subtract from a result as required. So how does movement work in this game? Well, it doesn't. Dagger Heart makes use of what I've been referring to as abstract range, in which range and movement is kind of up to the GM, typically making use of range bands like close, near, far, very far ranges. This is fine for when there's only one or two enemies to face, but personally I don't think this works super well for larger encounters as there can be a lot to keep track of. Theatre of the Mind combat isn't bad, but I don't feel it's best for games that want to have tactical combat or fight larger swaths of enemies, especially in a game that has rules for cover, hazards, etc. This game thankfully does have an optional rule for using grid-based combat, with defined versions of the before-mentioned ranges, but are kind of vague about how much one could actually move and some of the terminology. For example, close range is defined as 6 squares, and in this example, moving close during actions, we suddenly see the concept of primary actions. This is literally the only time this phrase is used, and it suggests moving farther than this as part of a move to go and attack someone requires making a successful agility roll to determined by the GM to safely make your way there. I just feel having a set sprint action or something to akin to it would work better than this kind of vagueness. Now, the weapons in this are a bit silly, but overall I like them. They're split into primary and secondary weapons. Primary being the thing you'd wield in your main hand, like a longsword, rapier, or two-handed weapons. Secondary weapons are used for utility or defensive purposes. This is where shields are found, which is odd, but it makes sense for the mechanic. Each weapon has an associated trait that's used for its rolls, damage, range, and features. Features are what makes the weapons more unique from one another, providing a nice way of them having their differing strengths and weaknesses. There's also magic weapons that can only be used by those with a spellcasting trait that act akin to cantrips in other games. All the weapons also fall within tiers to nicely gauge their rarity and powers, and full credit, they have provided plenty of different types of weapons with a plethora of modifiers, making them all a bit special. Now, armor is just my fave complexity of this game. As mentioned earlier, armor has its base thresholds which determine how much HP you lose whenever you take damage, and like weapons, they also have their own features, making it a superb game of weighing the pros and cons. They also have the base armor score, and this is wonderful. While wearing armor and you take damage, you can use a point of your armor score to reduce the damage by one tier. So severe damage would become major, major would become minor. This adds a whole other factor to how you design your character. Do you crank up the armor as high as you can at the cost of mobility and evasion, or focus on being mobile, or somewhere in between and just, this is what I love in game design. And of course, as that score hits 0, you'll have to repair it during your downtime, which, oddly enough, downtime has some of the clearest structure of this game. Downtime is your resting, taking the form of short and long rests, with lots of clear options outlined, giving that tactical choice of what resource you want to recover. A quick aside about the death mechanics this game has, as I think they are a good example of what this game's philosophy is. Death is treated as a big deal. It's a huge story impact and given a lot of reverence. When your hit points hit 0, you are given a choice. You can A. Go out in a blaze of glory performing an action with a guaranteed critical success before passing. B. Avoid death, instead dropping unconscious until healed, continuing to survive but now carrying a scar, which mechanically means you lose one of your hope slots, reducing how much hope you can store at a time, with this only being recoverable at the GM's discretion, with your last hope being your last life. And C. Risk it all. Roll your duality die, and if your hopes are higher, you stay on your feet and recover HP, or stress equal to the hope die roll. However, if your fear die is higher, that's it, there is no second chance. Resurrection isn't outside of possibility, however the only set method is a level 10 resurrection spell from the Splendid domain. However, if that isn't an option, it is entirely up to the GM. Now this game has players levels from 1 to 10, divided among 4 different tiers and only has milestones for levels. This means players level up when the GM decides. Now, there are some set bonuses at certain levels, but every time you level you can take 2 options from your tiers bracket as shown here. It's a little confusing, but basically each option can be taken a set number of times, and you'd mark which option you took after applying. For example, at level 3, you can choose 2 of the options shown, and each option can be taken a number of times equal to the number of boxes. So boosting evasion you can only take once at this tier, but you can increase your HP option twice. And finally, campaign frames, and this is a real nice tool to help GMs and players build a campaign setting together. You give a pitch, you work out the tone and feel you want to have, the themes of the story, and use touchstones, other series and stories that are the same vibe of what you will want to play. There are some examples within the book of how they establish this, and ultimately, I do think this is a useful tool to help get ideas flowing and figure out what the group wants to do. Okay, conclusion time. And yeah, this one is tough. Dagger Heart is a game for people who truly want to focus on the story, sometimes in spite of the game side of things. There's so many mechanics in this that I absolutely adore. The armor, the stress mechanics are absolutely wonderful for creating a sense of tactics, of planning and preparing for encounters, of making every moment count. But all of this detail, all of these mechanics, they are all attached to vibes. They are all at the whim of the mood, which means it's hard for any of them to hold any real weight. It doesn't matter how much you may prep or plan or build, if it all goes out the window when the story decides it's best if you just blast your way through with consecutive actions. I personally think the lack of an action economy hurts this game, and I barely touched on the more intricate mechanics in combat that they want to have. But without a proper way of conveying all the information, it would need to keep proper track of everything in a clear, concise way. It's clearly taking a lot of inspiration from D&D 5e, but wants to make it a greater focus on storytelling, whilst keeping that kind of structure. And it just doesn't stick the landing. It's like it's 2 games taking turns on which rules get used. It feels like a game made from the ground up to be hacked and homebrewed, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but I guess it's like asking for a shiny model and instead being given a model kit, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but isn't what you asked for. This game is deeply confused about what it wants to be. It's constantly pulling itself between the war game like D&D, but also a theatre of the mind storytelling focus like Vampire the Masquerade, and it just can't bully around that circle. Now with all that said, do I like Dagger Heart? Yes, right, but that's only because I enjoy homebrew and changing games to my liking. I enjoy model kits, and if you do as well, the game might be for you. But I don't consider it a game you can pick up and play. You gotta put in the work to adapt it to your group. And if that's not what you want from a game, or you don't think it's worth buying a game just to need to do that work to enjoy it, it's not going to be for you. And for those who are interested in my personal changes to the game to make it better to suit my taste, first add a simple action and economy for combat. Initiative rolls by making an agility check, highest roll goes first. One action, one movement action per turn. Action can be used as normal or to move double your movement speed per turn. Make use of the grid for positioning, hazards, cover, etc. 6 squares of movement by default can be broken up and used as you like during your turn. Reactions that can be established beforehand, taking inspiration from 5e and Pathfinder and whatever abilities you feel fit the current situation. And a rule I'm still playing around with but getting an additional action per turn at level 5 onward. And whilst these rules are still being fine-tuned, these make it a better experience for me and my players. Now obviously this isn't going to work for everyone, and every group is a bit different, so play the game how you like. But it's also fair to say a game that you have to put in the work to make functional isn't a good game. So this is very much going to be subjective depending on person to person. But what do you think of Dagger Heart? Love it? Hate it? Got custom rules for your own group that you like to run with? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and maybe subscribe for more yapping about TTRPGs. This has been a really fun video to work on, and I'll likely be covering the second Dagger Heart book coming out later this year, and hoping it brings along some new mechanics to flesh out the system some more. I've been Deval, and I'll see you next time. Happy adventuring!